Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to go over with you today the survey of Genesis 11:27 to 25:18. And yeah, this is a vast amount of material, but hopefully you're able to find some patterns. And so let's take a look at this text together to see if we can pull some of these things together. And one of the things you could have done was go through each of the chapters and assign it a easily remembered 3-4 word description that you can use to think through the material. I'm going to go straight to a chart and we'll talk about the units and then the subunits. Again, I think the best way to break this text up is to see it in terms of three really large units. Actually, one really large unit, one very small unit, and then a third, a medium-sized unit. I think the unit one is God's call and promises to Abraham. Well, in this case, he's still Abram at this point. And essentially, I'm just going to break this down. This is only 11:27 through 12:9, and again, there's going to be two subunits here. We get the backdrop to Abraham's story, his family background, which is a genealogy. And that's 11:27 through the end of chapter 11, and then we have the promises and call in chapter 12, verse 1 through 9. Now, this is going to be a significant passage. We're going to come back to this because this sets a backdrop. Then we have the large middle section, which is what I've entitled Living Under Promise. This is a much vaster section, and it runs from 12:10 all the way through chapter 20, verse 18. I'll come back to the subunits in a minute. Let's look at the unit 3. And unit 3 is what I've dubbed promises fulfilled partially. This is a significant piece of the story, is there are substantial fulfillments of the promises to Abraham, but in some cases these are partial. Like, for example, use of the word partial is God has promised all this land. When you get to the end of the narrative, the only land that God's people possess are the burial plots. But that is a partial fulfillment, for example, of the promise of land. Now, let's go back to this middle section. This middle section has a number of units, but there's a chiasm that sits in the middle of this section and gives it some organization. It's A, B, C, and then the center is a D. Then we have C prime, B prime, A prime. At the center of this story, to me, appears to be the story of Hagar and Ishmael. And what this is going to be is a major threat to God's promises. Now, what I see happening in this middle section here is God has made promises to Abram, right, who becomes Abraham in chapter 17. And this entire narrative then flows out of the promises in terms of there's threats, there's blessings, and then there's more promises that are made, that are reaffirmed. And you can look at the text and the narratives here. And so the first thing we have is in chapter 12, verses 10 to 20, we have a threat. We have Pharaoh and Sarah. In this case, we have Abram saying that Sarah is his sister when she's his wife, and what that creates is a scenario where this is a significant threat to God's promises. From chapter 13 through 14, 13:1 to 14:24, we have Abram, Lot, the first round of narratives about them. I'm going to call it number 1. And we have a blessing. In the sense that Lot is blessed because of his relationship to Abram. So he's rescued when things happened to him. And then 15:1 to 18, we have the kind of covenant language. This isn't specifically the Abrahamic covenant, but it's a precursor to it. If you do source criticism, this ends up kind of being the E story that goes along with the P covenant story from chapter 17. But in any case, we have a promise embedded here. So notice we have threat, blessing, and a promise. At the center, we're going to get a threat. So as we unpack this, 17:1 to 18:15 has to do with the covenant, calling this covenant number 2. And this is the Abrahamic covenant itself, where we have circumcision and renewed promises, including Abram becomes Abraham. And then we have B. We have another episode. This is the Sodom and Gomorrah story. But what do we have here? We have another scenario where we have Abraham now with Lot, number 2. And this is a blessing because, again, Lot is rescued because of his relationship with Abraham. And then we have a repeat of the first piece. We have the issue with Abimelech. Where again we find out that Abram is going to call his wife his sister. So this gives us a chiastic pattern that highlights the challenges surrounding God's promise to Abraham about a son. I mean, that's the significant thing that's in here. And even when we talk about the covenants, it has to do with offspring, right? This promise that this elderly couple is going to have a child of promise. These two attempts to dislodge Sarah out of relationship with Abraham are threats, and then a major threat ends up being the human scheme, and that's what it is, of Abraham and Sarah to conceive a child essentially through a surrogate, in this case, Sarah's slave girl or servant girl. And then the last set of texts then would break this up into 2 units essentially. And this is going to be 21:1 through 25:18. Break this into 2 pieces. Isaac born. And the test. So (21:1 through 22:24), and then B death, and marriage, where we have essentially Sarah's death, Isaac and Rebekah, and then Abraham's death. And all of these, in some ways, have to do with fulfillment of the promises. Now, that's essentially a way to break this unit up into 3 sections. I recognize that this is a vast passage, and we may have some places where we can disagree about this in class, but this is a way that I like to organize the material. And to me, the key thing was when I noticed this pattern, that creates this chiastic piece that holds all of these separate pieces together. Now, one of the critical things, and what we're going to see as we go back to here, is, again, when you're looking at structure, how do your units relate to each other? Well, we have 2 significant pieces here. First of all, 11:27 is we have a Toledot formula. Again, this is the way that Genesis is organized. And so this Toledot formula serves as a general statement that then is particularized in the rest of what happens. And so this is unlike the previous Toledot where we have lots of generations, in this story, and this ends up being now these are the descendants of Terah, Abraham's father. This is only going to cover essentially Abraham and then the birth of Abraham's son Isaac. So this is a short passage, but that's what we're going to see now is the Toledots are going to become fewer and fewer generations for the rest of the book of Genesis, right? And so this puts a focus. So Genesis 1 to 11 had multiple Toledots covering all of humanity up to the time of Abraham. Now the text becomes laser focused, and the focus is going to be on one family existing for the sake of the world of Genesis 1 through 11. So we have this Toledot. We also have, so that's a particularization that we have here. We also would want to call this opening section preparation realization. This gives us introductory material. So introduction or preparation realization. So this specifically gives us the characters. We also know that Terah is already on the way to Canaan. We know that Abram and his wife Sarai are unable to have children. So we have some significant data that then becomes critical for pushing this narrative down the road. Now, the actual call of Abraham takes place in 12:1 to 9. And you can include this as part of the introduction because you have additional pieces that show up here. Including the actual promises to Abraham. But you also have Abraham's obedience. Because don't miss one of the most significant verses in Scripture, 12:4, so Abraham went. So significant to drive this narrative home that Abraham responds in faithful obedience to God. And that's going to be a theme that we'll see throughout the rest of the Pentateuch. What is the response to grace? It's faithfulness, and Abraham models this from the beginning. And so we have this broader introduction that includes both background information on Abraham and Sarah and then also the promises, but you can also reckon these promises as a particularization as well. So this also forms another type of particularization. Or perhaps even instrumentation partially embodied here. The promises themselves are a general statement, but also a means. And then the ends then are going to be the fulfillment of God's promises throughout the rest of this material. But it's also the particulars of all this as well. So I would call this particularization with instrumentation. So what's actually promised here? Now, what Abraham has promised, he's going to be a great nation. He's also promised descendants, and he's promised land, right? And so these are going to be the paradigm that drives us forward. And in the midst of the promise to Abraham is you have the promise, I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse. All families of earth will be blessed through you. And so I will bless those who bless you. So what that means, that's how you can understand all these stories. So Pharaoh and Sarah and Abimelech, both Abimelech and Pharaoh act with integrity. They just want to marry Sarah, but they end up being what? Punished because they're cursed because they're a threat to God's promises. And God promises he's going to drive, unlike in the Genesis 1 to 11, God is taking the driver's seat and advancing God's mission through his own faithfulness to his promises. So God is going to protect Abraham from threats. This also is true of a threat from the inside because, again, Abraham, Sarah, acting in good faith in culturally appropriate ways, have a child, but the problem is Ishmael is not the child of promise. Ishmael is technically Abram's firstborn, but this is not the God had promised a child through Sarah and Abraham, not through a surrogate. So it ends up being a threat as well. Now, we also see examples, I will bless those who bless you. And so Lot is connected with Abraham, and so Abraham, his relationship with Lot, Lot receives the blessings of Abraham because of association with Abraham. And then you also get additional promises here. Now, the promises to Abraham are then passed on to Isaac. We'll see that specifically in chapter 25, though they're repeated several times to Abraham within his own narrative. And then they're passed on to Jacob. So the promises that we see early on in the Abrahamic narrative become essentially this driving force that takes the narrative all the way through the rest of the book of Genesis in terms of response to promises. Again, promises of source of blessing, descendants, and land. And those recur, and we can go through and mark all those things out. Now, there's also a climax here in this story. And again, you can locate it in different places. And to me, the climax of this story ends up being flowing out of here, the birth and specifically the test of Abraham and Isaac, because this sort of the whole driving force of this narrative is an heir for Abram, and that's part of God's promise. And then the child is born, Ishmael's pushed out, and then there's this incredible scene on Mount Moriah where Isaac is almost sacrificed, but then God prepares a substitute. And so there's so much theologically rich thinking in that section, but that tends to be what I would consider the climax of this section. In a sense, this makes these last stories anticlimactic, but in the sense that these are just showing the next steps. Now that we know that Isaac is safe, that Isaac's born, Isaac's the heir, these other stories then flow directly from that. We have the death of his mother, Sarah. Abraham buys a plot of land. There's the story of Isaac and Rebekah, how a wife is found for Isaac, which is kind of setting up the next step, the next block of stories, Isaac's own story. And then we have Abraham's death, and again, being buried in the plot that he purchased. So we have recurring of promise language that shows up in key places. Specifically, we have the repetition in here in 12. We have it again, especially in chapter 22, and we see it in 17 and chapter 18 as well in pieces. Now, what else goes in terms of some structures? You may have also found here some contrast. Essentially, Abram is contrasted with Lot throughout here. So Lot is kind of a negative foil, though Lot receives blessing because of association with Abraham. And there's also a contrast that runs through these two sections between Hagar, Ishmael, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and specifically this child of the flesh over against this child of promise. Again, notice that Ishmael ultimately receives a blessing. Again, that's because he's associated with Abraham. And let me say one thing quickly. One of the themes that you see throughout Genesis, and this is in the Old Testament as a whole, is God drives God's mission forward, not using typical human means. And so that can help us to understand some of the recurring themes. Like we saw it already in this case, we have the issue of a couple who's unable to have children. That's a common motif in the Old Testament where God intervenes to bring about a significant birth. So, for example, again, Isaac is probably the most famous, but we can go on to the next generations. If you remember, Rebecca has some problems, and even Jacob's wives have problems with fertility. Samson has a miraculous birth, and also we want to think about Samuel. Those are just a few examples of that motif. And again, the idea is that God advances his mission not because of a person's particularly power in being fertile, but God works through couples who struggle with childlessness to bring forth significant persons. The other thing that also shows up with this Hagar Ishmael story is the issue of the firstborn. Again, in the ancient Near East, families hedged their bets by going all in on the firstborn son. But what we've already seen a few times in Scripture is the firstborn son isn't the one who God uses to advance the mission. So you can think back, at some level, the Cain-Abel story is the secondborn getting one up on the firstborn. Isaac, secondborn, but he's the child of promise, so he gets the blessing, whereas Ishmael gets a different blessing, but he's not the blessing of being God, the one through whom God is going to advance the mission. And this continues on. The Jacob-Esau story, in some profound way, is also a flip of the birth order. So that shows up here. We also want to note a recurrence of a few other things. Altars. There's Abraham worships multiple times, and one of the things that Abraham models is how do we have an itinerant faith. And the thing that Abraham does is he moves around different places in Palestine as he builds altars. So you can look at some text. So he worships at Shechem, builds an altar in 12:7, Hebron, Beersheba, all these places, Mount Moriah, there's altars. So Abraham, in some ways, we can call Abraham Abe the altar builder. Some other pieces, there's other liturgical pieces. We have circumcision. We have examples of prayer. Now, this whole piece as a whole would be prose narrative. The atmosphere up and down, there's both dread and there's also joy. There's even confusion that takes place through here. And we want to note that chapter 15, verses 13 to 16 are difficult verses, but they predict the future slavery in Egypt and also have a murky kind of explanation for the coming occupation of the Promised Land, that the sin of the Amorites hasn't reached its fullness yet. That's in chapter 15, verse 16. So you want to take a look at that. Again, for each of the structures, you want to ask a set of structural questions. So, for example, if we wanted to just start with this Toledot statement, we would say, what precisely and specifically is the meaning of the phrase, these are the generations of Terah? How do the particulars in 11:28b all the way through 25:18 illuminate the meaning of the general statement? And what's involved in the particulars? Why is the Abrahamic narrative structured by particularization, starting in 11:27 with a Toledot statement, and then what are the full implications? Again, for a strategic area, you could pick the actual general statement, or you could pick some smaller section here. It's just one structure, so you want to ask definitional, rational, and implicational questions for each structure, and then pick a strategic area for each structure. Again, if you have other questions, let me know. I'm Brian Russell. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.